first time I asked a stranger about boundaries, I felt my throat tighten as if I had swallowed a golf ball. It was at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, rain pattering against the windows as I approached a woman who seemed approachable. She had a gentle smile and was reading a book on interpersonal psychology. "Excuse me," I stammered. "I am doing some personal research on how people set boundaries. Would you mind sharing your thoughts?" She looked up, surprised, and I immediately regretted my decision. My palms went slick with sweat as I waited for her to tell me to get lost. Instead, she closed her book and spoke for nearly 20 minutes about her journey with boundaries. How she used to be a people-pleaser who would agree to anything, how she learned the hard way that saying yes when she meant no only led to resentment, and how she eventually developed the courage to protect her time and energy without apology. As she spoke, I realized something profound. Most people have thought deeply about boundaries but rarely get asked about them. That conversation changed everything for me. It was the beginning of a 6-month journey where I interviewed over 100 strangers about their experiences with setting boundaries. What started as a personal quest to overcome my own guilt about saying no transformed into a collection of insights that fundamentally altered how I view human relationships. The patterns I discovered were both surprising and illuminating, revealing that the struggles we face in establishing healthy limits are remarkably universal, and yet the solutions are often hidden in plain sight. What follows is the story of that journey, the wisdom gathered from unexpected places, and the practical strategies that emerged from these conversations with strangers. This is not just about learning to set boundaries. It is about doing so without the weight of guilt that so often accompanies our attempts to protect our well-being. It is about discovering that when we learn to honor our limits with grace and clarity, we not only transform our own lives but also model for others what healthy relationships truly look like. When Gabriel Vance walked into my university research study on boundaries, he looked like the last person who would struggle with setting them. Tall, confident, with the relaxed demeanor of someone who knows exactly who he is and what he wants. Yet when our conversation began, he revealed a truth that would become a common thread throughout my interviews. "I know exactly what my boundaries are," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "But the moment I try to enforce them, I feel like the worst person in the world." Gabriel described growing up in a household where his needs were secondary to everyone else's. His mother, though loving, was overwhelmed raising 3 children alone, and she relied heavily on Gabriel to be the responsible one. By age 12, he was cooking dinner for his siblings, helping with homework, and making sure bills were sorted for his mother to review. "I never learned that it was okay to put myself first sometimes," he explained. "Every time I try to now, this voice in my head says I am being selfish." This phenomenon, knowing intellectually that boundaries are healthy but feeling emotionally that they are wrong, is what I came to call the guilt paradox. It is the uncomfortable space between understanding and implementation, where our rational mind tells us one thing while our emotional programming screams another. The guilt paradox exists for good reason. Humans are social creatures, evolved to maintain group harmony. Our ancestors survived because they cooperated, shared resources, and supported one another. Those who were too individualistic risked ostracism, which often meant death in harsh prehistoric environments. This evolutionary heritage lives on in our psychological makeup, manifesting as discomfort when we prioritize our needs over others. But there is another factor at play: early conditioning. Like Gabriel, many of us grew up in environments where setting boundaries was either explicitly discouraged or implicitly punished. Perhaps we had parents who made us feel responsible for their emotions, or we were praised for being easy children who never complained. Maybe we learned that love and acceptance were conditional upon meeting others' expectations. Whatever the specific circumstances, these early lessons become deeply ingrained, forming the foundation of our boundary-setting behaviors as adults. Fiona Knight, a therapist I interviewed at a psychology conference, described this conditioning eloquently. When children are repeatedly given the message that their needs matter less than others, they internalize the belief that asserting boundaries is an act of aggression rather than an act of self-care. This belief system becomes so embedded that even when they intellectually understand the importance of boundaries, the emotional residue of guilt remains. This explanation resonated with another interviewee, a barista named Marcus who approached me after overhearing a conversation I was having about my project. "I spent years in therapy learning that it was okay to say no," he told me during his break. "I can recite all the reasons why boundaries are healthy. But when my mother calls and asks me to drive 3 hours to help her with something she could easily hire someone to do, all that knowledge goes out the window. I say yes, and then I spend the entire drive resenting both her and myself." Marcus's experience highlights another aspect of the guilt paradox. We often say yes to avoid the immediate discomfort of saying no, only to experience deeper, longer-lasting negative emotions as a result. It is a form of emotional short-sightedness, sacrificing our long-term well-being for short-term peace. As my interviews continued, I began asking people a specific question. What happens in your body when you consider setting a boundary with someone important to you? The answers were remarkably consistent. Tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, shallow breathing, racing thoughts. These physical symptoms reveal that boundary setting is not just a cognitive challenge but a physiological one as well. Our bodies literally prepare for conflict when we consider protecting our limits, triggering the same stress response as if we were facing a physical threat. Understanding this physiological component was a key insight. It suggested that simply knowing about boundaries intellectually is insufficient. We need strategies to manage the physical sensations that arise when we attempt to establish them. This realization led me to explore techniques from various disciplines, from mindfulness practices to somatic therapy, that address both the mental and physical aspects of boundary-setting guilt. But before diving into those strategies, I needed to better understand the question at the heart of my research. What exactly makes boundary setting so difficult? To answer this, I had to delve deeper into the psychology of guilt and the social dynamics that reinforce it. I found myself at a community center in Portland, where I struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Dorothy, who was waiting for her granddaughter after a dance class. When I explained my project, her eyes lit up. "Oh, honey," she said, "I spent 70 years of my life being a doormat before I learned that saying no does not make you a bad person. Would you like to know what finally taught me that lesson?" I nodded eagerly, and she continued, "It was watching my daughter. She is 52 now, repeating all my mistakes. Seeing her exhausted, resentful, running herself ragged for people who barely appreciated it. It was like looking in a mirror, except the reflection showed all the damage I had done not just to myself but to her as well. I had modeled boundaryless living, and she had learned it perfectly." Dorothy's insight points to another dimension of the boundary guilt connection: the intergenerational transmission of boundary patterns. We often inherit our boundary styles from our parents, perpetuating cycles of either healthy limits or self-sacrifice across generations. Breaking these patterns requires not only personal change but also an awareness of the legacy we create through our examples. This brings us to a crucial question that opened the next phase of my research. If boundary setting is so natural and necessary, why does our culture make it feel like an act of betrayal? And more importantly, how can we learn to establish healthy limits without carrying the burden of guilt that so often accompanies them? Standing in line at a busy pharmacy, I noticed the woman ahead of me becoming increasingly agitated as the pharmacist explained that her insurance would not cover a particular medication. "But I need it today," she insisted, her voice rising. "There must be something you can do." The pharmacist, maintaining a professional tone, explained the options available, none of which seemed satisfactory to the customer. As the interaction continued, I found myself fascinated by the dynamics at play. Here was a clear boundary situation. The pharmacist was constrained by policies beyond her control, while the customer was pressing against those boundaries out of genuine need. When the customer finally stormed off, I approached the pharmacist with my usual question: "How do you feel when you have to maintain professional boundaries with upset customers?" Her response was illuminating. "It used to tear me up inside," she said, adjusting her name tag which read Sarah. "I would go home feeling like I had failed people, even though I was just doing my job according to the rules. But over time, I realized something important. Clear boundaries actually help most customers, even when they do not like those boundaries. Without them, I would be making exceptions based on who was most persistent or who made me feel guiltiest, and that is not fair to anyone." Sarah's insight touches on a profound truth about boundaries that emerged repeatedly in my interviews. Boundaries are not barriers to connection but foundations for it. They create the clarity and consistency that allow relationships to flourish without the confusion and resentment that arise from unclear expectations. This realization led me to explore the hidden psychology of boundaries, the underlying mechanisms that make them essential to our mental health and relationships. Through my conversations with strangers, 3 key psychological principles emerged. First, boundaries function as identity markers. They define where we end and others begin, clarifying our values, preferences, and needs. Without clear boundaries, we risk becoming chameleons, adapting to the expectations of others until we lose sight of our authentic selves. I witnessed this principle in action when interviewing Reed, a college student I met at a campus event. I used to think being likable meant being available to everyone all the time, he explained. I would drop everything when friends texted, stay up all night helping classmates with projects, and never say no to extra shifts at work. Then I had this weird moment when someone asked me what I liked to do for fun, and I honestly could not answer. I had spent so much time responding to others' needs that I had no idea what I actually enjoyed. Reed's experience highlights how boundary erosion can lead to a dissolution of self, a psychological state where we become so externally focused that we lose connection with our internal compass. Setting boundaries, then, is not just about managing our time or energy but about maintaining our sense of self in relation to others. The second psychological principle I discovered is that boundaries serve as trust-building mechanisms. This seems counterintuitive. Many of us fear that asserting boundaries will damage relationships. Yet my interviews revealed the opposite. Clear, consistent boundaries actually increase trust because they provide predictability and authenticity. Olivia, a business consultant I met on a flight to Chicago, explained it this way. When I first started my career, I said yes to everything: weekend work, last-minute travel, impossible deadlines. I thought it would make clients trust me more. But what actually happened was they started to take advantage of my availability, and the quality of my work suffered because I was stretched too thin. When I finally established clear working hours and realistic timelines, something surprising happened. My client relationships improved. They respected me more, and they could rely on the commitments I did make because they were sustainable. Olivia's experience reflects research findings that people are more likely to trust those who demonstrate healthy self-regard through appropriate boundary setting. When we honor our own limits, we signal to others that we are authentic and trustworthy, not simply seeking approval at any cost. The third psychological principle of boundaries is perhaps the most surprising. They function as compassion facilitators. Many of us equate boundarylessness with caring and boundaries with coldness. Yet true compassion requires boundaries to be sustainable. This principle was beautifully illustrated by Dr. Elaine Chun, an emergency room physician I interviewed. In the ER, we see human suffering at its most acute, she explained. If I allowed myself to become emotionally overwhelmed by each patient's pain, I would burn out within weeks and be unable to help anyone. My emotional boundaries are not walls. They are membranes, permeable enough to allow empathy but sturdy enough to protect my ability to function effectively. Dr. Chen's metaphor of boundaries as membranes rather than walls offers a powerful reframing. Boundaries are not about shutting others out but about regulating the flow of energy and involvement in ways that serve both parties. This regulation is the essence of sustainable compassion. As these psychological principles became clearer through my interviews, I began to understand why setting boundaries triggers guilt for so many of us. We have fundamentally misunderstood what boundaries are and how they function. We have been operating under several critical misconceptions. Misconception number 1: boundaries are selfish. Reality: boundaries enable generosity by preventing burnout and resentment. Misconception number 2: boundaries damage relationships. Reality: unclear boundaries damage relationships. Clear ones strengthen them. Misconception number 3: caring people should be available always. Reality: constant availability is unsustainable and ultimately leads to diminished capacity to care. These misconceptions are not accidental. They serve certain social and economic functions. A society of boundaryless individuals is easier to exploit for labor, emotional support, and resources. Systems from workplaces to families may unconsciously discourage boundary setting because it challenges existing power dynamics. This societal dimension became apparent when I spoke with Jamal, a corporate attorney who approached me after a talk I gave on my research. In my industry, there is an unspoken rule that you should always be available to clients and partners, he said. The people who set boundaries are seen as not being team players or lacking ambition. It took me years to realize this culture exists because it benefits the firm's bottom line, not because it makes for better lawyers or happier people. Jamal's observation points to a critical insight. Guilt about boundaries is often systemically reinforced. Understanding this can help us recognize when our guilt is not a personal moral failure but a programmed response to external pressures. Armed with this deeper understanding of boundary psychology, I began to wonder, if these misconceptions are so prevalent, how do some people manage to set boundaries effectively without being consumed by guilt? What strategies have they developed to navigate this complex psychological and social terrain? This question led me to the next phase of my research, identifying the specific techniques that allow people to establish healthy limits while maintaining both self-respect and compassion for others. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan as I sat on a bench along Chicago's lakefront path, watching joggers and cyclists pass by. Next to me was Gregory, a personal trainer I had just met who had agreed to talk about boundaries after overhearing my conversation with another stranger. "The way I see it," Gregory said, gesturing toward the lake, "boundaries are like the shoreline. The water is always testing the limits, pushing and pulling, but the shore stays firm. Not rigid but consistent. That is how I approach boundaries with my clients." Gregory explained that as a trainer, he constantly faces boundary challenges. Clients who text at all hours, who try to extend sessions without paying, who expect him to be their therapist as well as their fitness coach. Early in my career, I felt guilty setting limits. I worried clients would think I did not care or would find another trainer. But what I discovered was actually the opposite. The clients who respected my boundaries were the ones who stayed long-term and saw the best results. When I asked how he communicates his boundaries without feeling guilty, Gregory shared a technique that would become one of the most valuable insights from my research: the pre-framing method. "Before I take on any new client, I have a conversation about expectations," he explained. "I outline my availability, cancellation policies, and the scope of my services. I frame these boundaries as being in service of their goals. To help you achieve the best results, these are the parameters we will work within." This way, boundaries are established as part of the relationship from the beginning, not introduced as restrictions later on. Gregory's pre-framing technique addresses one of the core challenges of boundary setting: the fear that boundaries will be perceived as rejection or lack of care. By presenting boundaries as supportive structures rather than limitations, he transforms them from potential sources of conflict into foundations for success. This approach resonated with what I heard from Faith Kendrick, a hospice nurse I met at a community workshop on preventing burnout. In healthcare, particularly end-of-life care, there is tremendous pressure to give everything of yourself, she told me. The guilt can be overwhelming when you need to step back. What has helped me is reframing boundaries not as something I do to patients but something I do for them. By protecting my well-being, I ensure I can bring my best self to each interaction. Faith's reframing strategy highlights another key insight. Boundaries serve the relationship, not just the individual setting them. When we understand this, guilt begins to dissipate because we recognize that our self-care directly impacts our capacity to care for others. As my collection of interviews grew, I began categorizing the strategies people shared for setting boundaries without guilt. 3 distinct approaches emerged, each addressing different aspects of the boundary guilt connection. The first approach focuses on language, the specific words and phrases people use when communicating boundaries. Many interviewees emphasized the power of and statements over but statements. Diane, a university professor I met at a bookstore, explained, "When I need to decline a student's request for an extension, I could say, 'I understand you are going through a difficult time, but I cannot accept late assignments.' That 'but' negates my empathy. Instead, I say, 'I understand you are going through a difficult time, and our course policy on deadlines exists to ensure fairness for all students.' empathy and allows both my compassion and my boundary to exist simultaneously. This linguistic shift may seem subtle, but it addresses a fundamental cause of boundary guilt, the false belief that we must choose between empathy and limits. And language acknowledges that both can coexist, reducing the internal conflict that generates guilt. The second approach centers on timing, when and how boundaries are introduced. Many successful boundary setters described using what I came to call the preventative boundary strategy. Lucas, a freelance graphic designer, shared his experience. I used to get clients who would constantly request revisions beyond our agreement, and I would feel guilty charging extra or saying no. Now I address this upfront by saying, my fee includes 2 rounds of revisions. Additional revisions are available at $X per round. When I present this before any work begins, clients accept it as a normal part of our arrangement rather than a rejection when they want more changes. Preventative boundaries work because they establish expectations before emotional investment occurs. They become part of the foundation of the relationship rather than perceived as new restrictions imposed on an existing dynamic. The third approach focuses on the internal work necessary to set boundaries without guilt, addressing the beliefs and emotional patterns that make boundary setting difficult. Nathan, a recovery counselor I met at a community center, introduced me to what he calls permission slips, a technique he uses with both clients and himself. Before setting an important boundary, I write myself a literal permission slip, he explained, pulling a small note card from his wallet. It read, I give myself permission to prioritize my family time this weekend. My worth is not determined by constant availability to clients. Nathan's permission slips externalize the internal dialogue about worthiness and responsibility that often underlies boundary guilt. By making this dialogue concrete and intentional, he creates space between his conditioned responses and his conscious choices. These 3 approaches, linguistic reframing, preventative timing, and internal permission giving, formed the foundation of what I began to see as a comprehensive strategy for guilt-free boundary setting. But as valuable as these techniques were, they still did not fully address the social courage required to implement them in the face of potential disappointment or pushback from others. This missing piece emerged from my conversation with Tara, a customer service manager I met while waiting for a delayed flight. When I asked how she maintains boundaries with demanding customers without feeling guilty, she introduced me to the concept of the boundary budget. I think of my capacity for difficult boundary moments as a budget, she explained. I only have so much courage and emotional energy each day. So I ask myself, is this boundary worth spending my budget on? Some situations are high-value investments, like protecting my team from abusive customers or safeguarding my family time. Others are not worth the emotional cost. By budgeting my boundary energy, I focus on what truly matters and let go of guilt about the rest. Tara's boundary budget concept addresses a critical aspect of guilt-free boundary setting: discernment. Not all boundaries are equally important, and trying to perfectly maintain every boundary in every situation is a recipe for exhaustion and failure. By consciously choosing which boundaries to prioritize, we reduce the overall guilt burden and focus our emotional resources where they matter most. These insights from strangers, from Gregory's pre-framing to Tara's boundary budget, began to coalesce into a coherent approach to setting boundaries without guilt. But one crucial question remained: how do effective boundary setters respond when their boundaries are tested or challenged? The answer to this question would provide the final piece of the puzzle. The coffee shop was packed when I met with Ryan, a high school counselor who had contacted me after reading an article I published about my boundary research. We found a small table in the corner, and he immediately dove into what he called his boundary revelation. I always thought I was bad at boundaries because I would set them and then immediately cave when anyone pushed back, he explained, stirring his latte. I would say, I cannot stay late today to my principal, but when she responded with, but we really need you for this meeting, I would fold instantly. Then I realized something. Setting a boundary is not a one-time event. It is a conversation that continues when the boundary is tested. Ryan's insight highlights a critical aspect of boundaries that many people miss. Boundaries are not simply stated. They are maintained through consistent reinforcement when tested. This ongoing process requires specific skills to navigate without succumbing to guilt. Through my interviews, I identified 5 common boundary tests that trigger guilt, along with strategies that successful boundary setters use to address them. 1. The emergency test, when someone frames their request as an urgent crisis that only you can solve. Mia, an executive assistant I met at a networking event, described her approach. When my boss comes to me with a drop-everything emergency that is not actually an emergency, I use what I call the reality check question. I understand this feels urgent. Can you help me understand what specifically will happen if this waits until tomorrow when I can give it my full attention? This question often reveals that the emergency is actually a preference rather than a true crisis. Mia's strategy works because it shifts the conversation from emotional urgency to factual consequences, reducing the guilt trigger while maintaining professionalism. 2. The disappointment test, when someone responds to your boundary with visible disappointment or hurt. Carlos, a family therapist, shared his technique. I teach clients the pause, acknowledge, reaffirm method. When someone responds to your boundary with disappointment, pause to let yourself feel the discomfort without immediately reacting to it. Then acknowledge their feeling without taking responsibility for it. I can see you are disappointed by my decision. Finally, gently reaffirm your boundary. And I still need to decline. This 3-step process allows us to show empathy without abandoning our limits, addressing the false dichotomy that often triggers guilt. 3. The comparison test, when someone points out that others would not set this boundary. Jennifer, a nurse practitioner, described facing this test regularly. Patients sometimes say things like, "My last doctor always prescribed this when I asked," or, "Other providers would not make me wait." I respond with what I call the professional standard statement. I understand different providers may have different approaches. My responsibility is to provide care according to my best professional judgment, which in this case means Jennifer's approach acknowledges the comparison without accepting it as an obligation to match others' boundary choices. This protects against the guilt that comes from feeling like we are the only one with a particular limit. 4. The historical test, when someone reminds you that you did not set this boundary in the past. Teresa, a mother of 3 teenagers, shared her strategy. When my kids say, "But you let me do this before," I use the growth response. "You are right, I did handle this differently before. As I have thought about it more, I realized a different approach works better for our family. I am still learning and growing as a parent." Teresa's growth response transforms potential guilt into a positive model of healthy evolution, showing that changing boundaries is not a sign of inconsistency, but of thoughtful development. 5. The reciprocity test, when someone implies you owe them compliance because of what they have done for you. James, a software developer, described his experience. My colleagues often expect me to work weekends because they covered for me when I was sick. I use the gratitude-clarity pairing. I really appreciate you helping when I needed it. That meant a lot to me, and I need to protect my weekend time for my family. I would be happy to find another way to return the favor that works for both of us. This approach honors the relationship while maintaining the boundary, separating gratitude from obligation in a way that minimizes guilt. These strategies for responding to boundary tests address a crucial reality. The moment of setting a boundary is often less challenging than the moments that follow, when our resolve is tested by others' responses. By preparing for these tests in advance, we can maintain our boundaries without the guilt spiral that often accompanies them. As my research progressed, I began to notice another pattern. The most effective boundary setters were not simply reacting to boundary violations but actively creating cultures of mutual respect for boundaries in their relationships. This proactive approach was exemplified by Sophia, a team leader at a marketing firm, who shared her practice of boundary exchanges. When I start working with new team members, I initiate a conversation about working styles and needs, she explained. I share my boundaries first. I do not check email after 7 p.m. or on weekends unless we have a launch, and I prefer to have meeting-free Wednesdays for focused work. Then I explicitly invite them to share their boundaries. What are your needs around communication, availability, and work style? This exchange normalizes boundaries as a two-way street rather than a power move. Sophia's boundary exchanges create what psychologists call psychological safety, an environment where people feel secure expressing needs and limits without fear of negative consequences. By initiating these exchanges, she shifts the entire dynamic around boundaries from potential conflict points to mutual agreements that benefit everyone. This concept of creating boundary-positive environments emerged as a powerful antidote to boundary guilt. When we actively foster cultures, whether in families, workplaces, or friendships, where everyone's boundaries are acknowledged and respected, the guilt associated with setting our own boundaries diminishes dramatically. Lisa, a parent of 2 young children, described how she applies this principle at home. We have a family meeting every Sunday where everyone, including the kids, can bring up any boundary needs for the coming week. My 6-year-old might say she needs quiet time after school before starting homework. My husband might mention he has a big project and needs extra focus time in the evening. I might share that I need help with morning routines because I have early meetings. We treat everyone's boundaries as equally valid, which teaches our children that having limits is normal and healthy. Lisa's family meetings demonstrate how boundary culture can be intentionally cultivated even with young children, creating a foundation for guilt-free boundary setting that can last a lifetime. The insights from these conversations with strangers revealed a profound truth. The ability to set boundaries without guilt is not just an individual skill but a cultural practice. The more we normalize boundaries in our various life contexts, the easier it becomes to maintain them without emotional distress. This cultural dimension of boundary setting led me to my final area of inquiry. How do we navigate boundaries across different cultural expectations and power dynamics? The answer to this question would complete the picture of guilt-free boundary setting in all its complexity. The international terminal at JFK Airport provided an unexpected research opportunity when a 3-hour delay left me sitting next to Priya, a cross-cultural business consultant who traveled between the United States and India. When I mentioned my research on boundaries and guilt, she laughed knowingly. In some cultures, the very concept of individual boundaries is seen differently, she explained. In more collectivist societies like where I grew up in southern India, the emphasis is on group harmony rather than personal space. The first time I worked in New York, I was shocked by how directly Americans would say no to requests or leave the office at exactly 5 p.m., regardless of what was happening. It seemed almost rude to me then. Priya's observation highlights a critical dimension of boundary setting that I had not fully appreciated. Cultural context significantly shapes what boundaries are considered appropriate and how they should be communicated. This insight expanded my understanding of why boundary guilt can be particularly intense for people navigating multiple cultural expectations. Through subsequent conversations with individuals from various cultural backgrounds, I identified several approaches for setting boundaries across cultural differences without intensifying guilt. The first approach involves recognizing cultural patterns without stereotyping. May, a Chinese-American professor I met at an academic conference, explained, "There is a general tendency in my Chinese family toward indirect communication about needs and limits, but that does not mean every Chinese person or family operates this way. I have learned to observe the specific patterns in each relationship rather than assuming based on cultural background." May's nuanced approach prevents the guilt that comes from feeling caught between cultural stereotypes. By focusing on the actual communication patterns in each relationship, she finds authentic ways to express boundaries that respect both her needs and the relationship context. The second approach centers on cultural code switching, adapting boundary communication to different cultural contexts without compromising the boundaries themselves. Ahmed, a marketing executive who works between Dubai and London, described his strategy. In some contexts, a direct no would damage relationships, while in others, anything less would be seen as deceptive. I maintain the same core boundaries everywhere, like not working on family vacations, but I express them differently. In London, I might say, "I cannot take that call. I am on holiday with my family." In Dubai, I might say, "I would love to help with that project. I will be fully available when I return from spending important time with my family on the 15th. Ahmed's code switching preserves his boundaries while adapting the communication style to minimize negative impacts in different cultural contexts. This reduces guilt by allowing him to honor both his personal needs and cultural expectations. The third approach addresses the complex intersection of culture and power dynamics in boundary situations. Letitia, a Black woman working in corporate finance, shared her experience. As a Black woman in a predominantly white male industry, I face additional scrutiny when I set boundaries. There is often an unspoken expectation that I should work harder and be more available than my colleagues. I have developed what I call documentation boundaries. I put my work hours and availability in writing, reference company policies when setting limits, and keep records of how my boundaries compare to institutional standards. This gives me concrete evidence that my boundaries are reasonable when they are questioned. Letitia's strategy addresses the reality that boundary setting does not occur in a vacuum but within systems of power and privilege. Her documentation approach provides protection against both external criticism and internal guilt by grounding her boundaries in objective standards rather than subjective feelings. These culturally informed boundary strategies reveal an important truth. Effective boundary setting without guilt requires adaptability rather than rigidity. The goal is not to apply the same boundary approach in every situation, but to maintain consistent inner boundaries while flexibly communicating them in ways that respect different cultural contexts. This insight led me to explore how people navigate boundaries in particularly challenging cultural environments, places where boundary setting is actively discouraged or even penalized. What I discovered was both sobering and inspiring. Raphael, a former member of a high-demand religious group, described the intense guilt he experienced when first establishing boundaries after leaving. In the community where I grew up, individual needs were considered selfish and worldly. Saying no to a leader's request was seen as spiritual rebellion. When I first started setting boundaries after leaving, the guilt was almost unbearable. I would have panic attacks, convinced I was betraying God. Raphael's journey to guilt-free boundaries involved what he called value realignment, a process of examining the beliefs underlying his guilt and consciously adopting new values that supported healthy limits. I had to recognize that my old guilt was based on values I no longer accepted. I worked to develop new core values, like authenticity, mutual respect, and sustainable service, that made boundaries not just acceptable but necessary. This process of value realignment emerged as a powerful approach for anyone whose boundary guilt stems from belief systems that equate self-sacrifice with virtue. By consciously examining and updating these beliefs, we can reduce the gap between our intellectual understanding of boundaries and our emotional responses to setting them. Another challenging context for boundaries is family systems with long-established patterns of enmeshment. Danielle, a family therapist I interviewed, introduced me to the concept of incremental boundaries for these situations. When family systems have operated without healthy boundaries for generations, trying to establish firm boundaries all at once often leads to system collapse and overwhelming guilt, she explained. Instead, I recommend clients start with small, less emotionally charged boundaries and gradually expand. Perhaps begin with a boundary around phone call duration before tackling bigger issues like holiday expectations or financial support. Danielle's incremental approach acknowledges that boundary setting is a skill developed over time, not an overnight transformation. By starting small and building gradually, we can acclimate both ourselves and others to new relationship patterns without triggering overwhelming guilt or destabilizing important connections. The cultural dimension of boundary setting revealed that guilt-free boundaries require not just personal techniques but systemic awareness. We need to understand the cultural waters we swim in, from family cultures to organizational cultures to national cultures, and develop approaches that work within or thoughtfully challenge these contexts. This realization brought me to the final and perhaps most important insight of my research: the connection between boundaries and authentic connection. Contrary to the fear that boundaries separate us from others, the strangers I interviewed consistently described how healthy boundaries had deepened their most meaningful relationships. The community garden was alive with activity as volunteers planted spring seedlings in freshly turned soil. Among them was Elena, a woman in her 60s with soil-stained hands and an air of quiet confidence. When our conversation turned to boundaries, her eyes lit up. For 40 years, I was the person everyone came to with their problems, she told me, patting soil around a tomato plant. Friends, family, co-workers, I was always available, always listening, always helping. I thought that was what made me a good person, what made people love me. Elena described how this boundaryless approach to relationships eventually led to severe burnout and depression. I was giving from an empty cup. I resented the very people I cared about most. And the strange thing was, despite all my availability, my relationships felt shallow. People saw me as a resource, not as a whole person with my own needs. Her turning point came after a health scare that forced her to step back from her caretaking role. When I started saying no, setting limits on my time and emotional energy, I was terrified people would abandon me. What actually happened was the opposite. The relationships that mattered deepened. For the first time, there was reciprocity. I was not just giving but also receiving. And some relationships did fall away, but I came to see that those were connections that existed only because of what I provided, not who I was. Elena's experience illuminates what I came to see as the central paradox of boundaries and connection. True intimacy requires the differentiation that boundaries provide. Without clear delineation between self and other, authentic connection becomes impossible. We end up relating to projections and expectations rather than to actual people in all their complexity. This paradox emerged repeatedly in my interviews with strangers. People who had moved from boundaryless people-pleasing to healthy limit-setting consistently reported not a loss of connection but a transformation of it. Their relationships became fewer but deeper, less driven by obligation and more by genuine affinity. Matthew, a middle school teacher I met at a professional development workshop, described this transformation in his classroom relationships. I used to think being a good teacher meant being available to students 24/7, letting them text me with questions at all hours, spending my lunch periods tutoring rather than recharging. I was burning out, and ironically, my teaching was suffering. When Matthew established clearer boundaries, designated office hours, communication protocols, protected planning periods, he feared students would feel abandoned. What actually happened was they began to respect my time more. And because I was more rested and prepared, the time I did spend with them was higher quality. Most surprisingly, they started mirroring my boundaries, becoming more self-directed and less dependent. By modeling healthy limits, I was actually teaching them an essential life skill. Matthew's experience highlights another aspect of the boundary connection paradox. When we set healthy limits, we not only protect ourselves but also empower others. By refusing to rescue people from every difficulty or meet every need, we create space for them to develop their own resources and resilience. This empowerment effect was evident in Hannah's story as well. A substance abuse counselor I interviewed, Hannah described how maintaining firm boundaries with clients actually supported their recovery. Early in my career, I would respond to crisis calls at all hours, bend program rules for clients I felt sorry for, and take responsibility for their sobriety. I thought my dedication would help them get better. What Hannah discovered was that her boundary violations, though well-intentioned, were actually enabling her clients' dependence. When I established clearer boundaries, consistent consequences for program violations, limited after-hours availability, explicit expectations for client participation, some clients initially pushed back hard. But over time, something shifted. They began taking more responsibility for their recovery. My boundaries were not abandoning them. They were believing in their capacity to manage their own lives. These insights reveal a profound truth about boundaries and relationships. Boundaries are not walls but containers. They do not prevent connection but rather create the conditions under which authentic connection can flourish. Without them, relationships become dominated by unconscious patterns of demand and supply, projection and performance. The strangers I interviewed who had mastered guilt-free boundary setting shared a common perspective. They viewed boundaries not as selfish acts but as relationship investments. By clarifying what was and was not acceptable, by protecting their energy and authenticity, they were actually contributing to healthier, more sustainable connections. This reframing from boundaries as rejection to boundaries as investment offers a powerful antidote to boundary guilt. When we understand that our limits serve not just our well-being but the integrity of our relationships, the false choice between self-care and caring for others dissolves. Dr. Michael Torres, a couples therapist I interviewed, explained this dynamic using the metaphor of a dance. In relationships without boundaries, people end up stepping on each other's toes constantly because they do not know where they end and the other begins. Clear boundaries create choreography. They allow for beautiful, coordinated movement because each person knows their position and respects the other's space. The dance actually becomes more intimate, not less, because each partner can fully express themselves within the agreed structure. This dance metaphor captures the essence of how boundaries enhance rather than inhibit connection. By creating clarity about roles, expectations, and limits, boundaries reduce the friction and resentment that arise from boundary violations, allowing the relationship energy to flow toward genuine intimacy rather than boundary management. As my research neared its conclusion, I realized that the most powerful insight about guilt-free boundary setting was this: when we set boundaries with clarity and compassion, we are not taking something from our relationships but giving something to them, the gift of authenticity, sustainability, and respect. This realization transforms boundary setting from a necessary but guilt-inducing chore to a profound act of care for both ourselves and our relationships. 6 months after beginning my conversations with strangers about boundaries, I found myself sitting in a park in Boston, reflecting on how dramatically my own relationship with boundaries had transformed. The guilt that once consumed me when saying no or setting limits had diminished significantly. In its place was a quiet confidence, not rigid or defensive, but grounded in a deeper understanding of what boundaries actually are and why they matter. This transformation did not come from theory alone but from practice, from applying the wisdom gathered from strangers to my own relationships. The final phase of my research involved testing these approaches in real-world boundary situations and refining them based on what actually worked. What emerged was a practical framework for guilt-free boundary setting that anyone can apply, regardless of their starting point. The framework involves 3 essential elements: preparation, communication, and reinforcement. Preparation is the foundation of effective, guilt-free boundaries. Before attempting to set a significant boundary, successful boundary setters engage in several key preparation steps. First, they clarify their motivation. Lauren, a social worker I interviewed, described her process. Before setting any boundary, I ask myself, am I doing this from a place of self-respect or from anger? Is this about protecting my well-being or punishing someone else? If the motivation is not grounded in self-care, I wait until I can approach the boundary from a clearer place. This motivation check prevents boundaries from becoming weapons or reactions, reducing the guilt that comes from setting boundaries from an unhealthy place. Second, effective boundary setters consider impact. They think through how the boundary might affect others and prepare to address legitimate needs that their boundary might impact. Trevor, a project manager, shared his approach. When I needed to set a boundary around not checking email on weekends, I first considered what legitimate work needs might arise during that time. I then created a system, an emergency contact protocol and Monday morning priority review, to address those needs without sacrificing my boundary. This preparation allowed me to set the boundary with confidence rather than guilt because I knew I was being responsible. Third, they prepare for their own emotional response. Many interviewees described practicing self-compassion statements in advance of difficult boundary conversations, knowing that guilt or doubt might arise. Amara, a therapist, recommended this practice. Before any challenging boundary moment, I write down 3 statements affirming my right to this boundary. For example, I deserve time for rest. Setting this limit allows me to show up fully in other areas. This boundary serves my long-term ability to contribute. Having these statements ready helps me weather the guilt that might come up in the moment. With thorough preparation complete, the next element is communication, how we express our boundaries to others. The most effective boundary communicators shared several practices. They use clear, direct language without over-explaining or apologizing. Excessive justification often signals to others and ourselves that the boundary is negotiable or that we feel guilty about it. Simon, a consultant, shared the phrase template he uses, I have decided to boundary. This allows me to positive outcome. I appreciate your understanding. The simplicity of this template prevents the rambling explanations that often undermine boundary statements. They focus on what they can do rather than what they cannot. This positive framing reduces defensiveness in both the communicator and the receiver. Zoe, a volunteer coordinator, gave this example. Instead of saying, I cannot take on any more projects this month. Which sounds negative. I say, I am fully committed to the 3 projects we have discussed, and I want to give them my best attention. This feels better to say and is better received. They separate the boundary from the relationship. By explicitly affirming the relationship while setting the limit, they reduce the fear of rejection that can trigger guilt. Carlos, a father of teenagers, shared his approach. When setting boundaries with my kids, I always include a connection statement. I love you, and I need you to respect my privacy when my office door is closed. This reminds both them and me that boundaries exist within relationships, not in opposition to them. The final element of the framework is reinforcement, the ongoing practices that maintain boundaries over time without accumulating guilt. Successful boundary maintainers consistently monitor and adjust their boundaries rather than treating them as fixed and unchangeable. This flexibility prevents boundaries from becoming rigid rules that generate guilt when circumstances change. Tina, a small business owner, described her quarterly boundary review. Every 3 months, I assess which boundaries are working, which need adjustment, and what new boundaries might be needed. This regular review prevents me from clinging to boundaries that no longer serve me or feeling guilty about changing them. They celebrate boundary successes rather than taking them for granted. Many interviewees described the importance of acknowledging when they had successfully maintained an important boundary, especially in challenging circumstances. Marcus, a recovery coach, encouraged this practice. When you successfully maintain a boundary, whether it is declining an invitation that would overextend you or leaving work on time despite pressure to stay, take a moment to acknowledge that success. This positive reinforcement helps rewrite the guilt narrative over time. They develop boundary community, relationships with others who understand and support healthy limits. Almost every person I interviewed who had mastered guilt-free boundaries mentioned the importance of supportive relationships in maintaining this practice. Diane, a nurse, described her boundary buddy system. My colleague and I check in with each other about our boundaries regularly. We celebrate each other's boundary victories and problem-solve challenges. Having someone who affirms my right to have limits has been essential in overcoming boundary guilt. This 3-part framework, preparation, communication, and reinforcement, provides a practical approach to implementing the insights gathered from strangers about guilt-free boundary setting. By engaging in these practices consistently, we can gradually transform our relationship with boundaries, reducing guilt and increasing confidence in our right to protect our well-being. As my research journey came to a close, I found myself reflecting on perhaps the most surprising insight of all. The people I interviewed who had mastered guilt-free boundary setting were not less caring or less connected than others. On the contrary, they were often the most deeply engaged in meaningful service and authentic relationships. This reality challenges the fundamental fear that drives boundary guilt, the fear that protecting ourselves means abandoning others. The evidence from hundreds of conversations suggests exactly the opposite. When we set healthy boundaries without guilt, we become more capable of genuine care, more authentic in our connections, and more effective in our contributions. On the last day of my 6-month journey interviewing strangers about boundaries, I found myself back at the same Seattle coffee shop where it had all begun. As I sipped my coffee, I reflected on how my understanding of boundaries had transformed through these conversations with people from all walks of life. I had started this project seeking techniques to set boundaries without guilt. What I discovered was something much deeper, a fundamental reframing of what boundaries actually are. Rather than barriers to connection or necessary evils, boundaries emerged as gifts we offer to ourselves and others. They are the foundations of authenticity, the guardians of integrity, and, paradoxically, the facilitators of true intimacy. The strangers who shared their stories with me, from the hospice nurse to the corporate attorney, from the parent of teenagers to the personal trainer, each contributed a piece to this new understanding. Their collective wisdom revealed that guilt-free boundaries are not achieved through techniques alone, but through a transformed relationship with the very concept of limits. When we view boundaries as expressions of self-respect rather than selfishness, as clarity rather than rejection, as sustainable service rather than withdrawal, the guilt that once accompanied them begins to dissolve. In its place grows a quiet confidence, not arrogance or indifference, but the grounded certainty that by honoring our limits, we become more fully available for what truly matters. Perhaps the most powerful insight from these conversations is this: boundaries are not just about saying no. They are about creating space for a more authentic yes. A yes that comes from choice rather than obligation, from alignment rather than fear, from sufficiency rather than depletion. As I prepare to leave the coffee shop, I notice a woman at a nearby table clearly struggling with a work call. Her face shows the tension of someone caught between competing demands, trying to please everyone at her own expense. I recognize that expression. It was my own for so many years. When she ends her call with a sigh, I take a chance and approach her. "Excuse me," I say. "I could not help overhearing your call. I have been researching how people set boundaries without feeling guilty. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on that topic?" Her eyes widen with surprise, then recognition. "Actually," she says with a small laugh, "I could really use that research right about now." And so another conversation begins. Another exchange of struggles and insights, fears and possibilities. As we talk, I share what I have learned from 100 strangers. That boundaries are not selfish but necessary, that guilt diminishes with practice, that the people who truly value us will adjust to our limits, and that those who do not may not belong in our inner circle. I tell her about pre-framing and permission slips, about the power of and statements and the importance of boundary communities. But mostly, I share the fundamental truth that transformed my own relationship with boundaries. That by protecting our time, energy, and authenticity through clear limits, we do not diminish our capacity for connection, but expand it immeasurably. As our conversation draws to a close, she thanks me with tears in her eyes. "I never thought about boundaries that way before," she says. "I always saw them as something that would make people like me less. But the way you describe them as acts of honesty and self-respect makes me think they might actually allow people to know and love the real me." In her words, I hear the echo of my own journey, from viewing boundaries as necessary burdens to recognizing them as pathways to authenticity and deeper connection. And I realize that this is the true gift of guilt-free boundaries. They allow us to show up in our relationships as our genuine selves, neither diminished by endless accommodation nor isolated by rigid walls, but present and real and appropriately boundaried. As I leave the coffee shop and step into the Seattle rain, I carry with me the wisdom of 100 strangers who taught me that setting boundaries without guilt is not just possible but transformative. A practice that honors both our own humanity and the humanity of those around us. It is a practice that allows us to live and love from a place of authenticity rather than obligation, creating relationships built on mutual respect rather than unspoken resentment. And perhaps most importantly, it is a practice available to all of us, regardless of our starting point or past patterns. With each boundary we set from a place of self-respect rather than fear, with each limit we maintain with clarity rather than apology, we move closer to a life of genuine connection, with others and with ourselves. In a world that often equates boundarylessness with virtue, choosing to honor our limits without guilt becomes not just an act of self-care but an act of quiet revolution. A statement that we value ourselves enough to protect our well-being and that we value our relationships enough to bring our authentic selves to them. This, ultimately, is the lesson of guilt-free boundaries. When we honor our limits with courage and compassion, we create the conditions for a more authentic, sustainable, and deeply connected life. A gift not just to ourselves but to everyone whose lives we touch. By asking strangers their thoughts on setting boundaries without feeling guilty, we discover that true connection happens not by erasing our limits, but by honoring them with clarity, creating relationships built on mutual respect rather than unspoken obligation.